the mayhem, thousands of black Tulsans were rounded up and confined to fairgrounds and ball fields. The National Guard imposed martial law on June 1st. Thereafter, black citizens were required to carry identity cards. The rampage lasted an estimated 16 hours. It ended on the evening of June 1st with more than 35 square blocks of the district destroyed. 10,000 black people were left homeless and destitute. Hundreds were injured. The precise number of dead is unknown. Estimates range from 39 to 300.
After the massacre, hundreds fled to towns around Tulsa or to other states. We also know that there were those who were murdered and buried in mass graves. The third group were those who were taken and put into internment camps. So this is what happened to the black community, and one has to stop and think what that means. The devastation of losing your home, your business, family members, and then to walk out of these internment camps and have to rebuild.
It's unclear as to whether or not we'll ever know the identities of the perpetrators, but let's remember, when we talk about the direct perpetrators, we're talking about thousands of folks, a large segment of the white male population in the community. We know through ancillary evidence that parts of the leadership of the community were at least complicit in what happened. We know, for example, that the Tulsa Tribune, the daily afternoon newspaper, published a series of incendiary articles and editorials that really fomented hostility in the white community against the black community.
Despite the unprecedented horrors of May 31st and June 1st, no perpetrators were charged or tried. Indeed, the victimized community was blamed.
After the massacre, a grand jury made of 12 white men appointed by the governor indicted a number of black citizens for the massacre, the riot, they called it, and some whites as well. But in the end, the grand jury effectively blamed it on the black community of Greenwood.
The Tulsa City Commission issued a report 2 weeks after the massacre. In it, Mayor T.D. Evans was unequivocal. Let the blame for this Negro uprising lie right where it belongs, on those armed Negroes and their followers who started this trouble and who instigated it.
We've since unearthed the City Commission meeting minutes from that era, as well as the meeting minutes from the Chamber of Commerce from that era. What you see in both is almost immediate recognition after the event happened of shame and embarrassment, and a desire to try and cover it up, believing, I think accurately, that it did not reflect well on Tulsa.
This is Tulsa, one of the richest cities in the country and oil capital of the world.
Tulsa's civic and business leaders succeeded in suppressing the truth of the carnage, and the city resumed business as usual. The white community continued to prosper. The black community did not. For decades, massacre survivors and their descendants sought compensation for their losses from city government and insurance companies to no avail.
You can watch the full documentary, Tulsa, the Fire and the Forgotten, tonight on your PBS station. And joining me now to talk about the legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre is Tiffany Crutcher. She is a native of Tulsa and a civil rights activist who is working with the Black Wall Street Legacy Festival. Her twin brother, Terrence Crutcher, was shot and killed by a police officer in 2016. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for being here. What's been the lasting impact, you think, of the Tulsa Race Massacre when you think about the harm done 100 years ago and the consequences that we still live with today?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Yamiche. Man, as I sit here on the actual centennial, the 100-year anniversary of the worst racial terror attack on U.S. soil, I can't help but reflect back on and just think about my great-grandmother and the fear and the terror and the pain and the trauma that she had to endure fleeing for her life and running for her life. And you know, fast forward close to 100 years later, I can't help but think about today, my brother, Terrence Crutcher, who was killed by the same police department. So today has been somber. It's been a bittersweet moment. We just finished paying homage to all of the lives that were lost, over 300 that we know of. We believe that there were more. You know, the fact that we have to do this and commemorate, that's the bitter part. But the sweet part was being there with two of our last known living survivors, Viola Fletcher and Hughes Van Ellis, who was a World War II veteran. Just having them there and knowing that they survived, it's a really special moment.
And you brought up your brother, who was unarmed and was shot less than 3 miles away from Black Wall Street, which of course was destroyed during the massacre. Talk a bit more about the connection you see between Terrence's death and the violence Black people experienced during this massacre and other massacres that we don't talk about.
Absolutely, and I can't really talk about, you know, the massacres and the experience that Terrence had to endure without even talking about what happened on January 6th with the insurrection. I mean, it brought back memories. It brought back, you know, the stories of the mobs of white rioters that fled into a Black prosperous community and leveled it to the ground, shot innocent men with their hands in the air. Doctors and lawyers didn't render first aid. And then in Terrence's case, I see that video of police officers fleeing towards Terrence, a mob of white police officers, and Terrence wasn't doing anything, helicopters looming, saying that he looked like a bad dude. The parallels are so stark. And then I think about January 6th and the mobs that stormed the nation's capital. Nothing has changed. The residual effects of the Tulsa race massacre of 1921 still reverberates through history and through my family's traumatic history today on the 100-year anniversary.
And when you talk about January 6th, there are recent things, of course, the massacre being 100 years ago, but there is also highway construction, there's gentrification that has forced Black people in Tulsa into other areas, something that we've seen all over the country. Make that connection to not just the massacre, but what happened even after that.
We were known as Black Wall Street. We had economic enterprise, and we were robbed of our generational wealth. But 100 years later, the railroad tracks that divided South Tulsa, the white side of town, from North Tulsa, those tracks still symbolize the same thing, the racial divide, except we have nothing. We own nothing in this historic community. Gentrification is running rampant. All you see are high rises and condos and restaurants, but none of it is owned by us, and we believe that it's shameful. And our kids' life expectancy is 11 years less on the Black side of town than a kid's life expectancy on the South side of town. We live in food deserts. We've been left behind simply because of the residual effects of the 1921 race massacre.
What do you think needs to be done for the descendants of the victims and the community more widely when you think of the massacre? And is there a way to get enough people to decide on what reparations might look like?
I must note we have 3 last known living survivors that are still here at the age of 107, 106, and the 100 years old, who recently testified at the nation's capital. And I yield to them, and what they said we needed was justice, reparations, atonement, repair, respect, and they have yet to receive that, and that trickles down into the descendants. We've filed a lawsuit against the city of Tulsa, the county, the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce, and nothing has been done. But I will say this, at the ceremony that we held today, the general, the major of the Oklahoma National Guard was there, and he stated that they didn't do enough to stop what happened. And he gave an official apology to the survivors and to our community. And it was an emotional moment.
And a new bill banning the teaching of some race concepts in Oklahoma schools was recently signed into law. What impact might that have on the ability to really face the ongoing harm of the massacre and violence against Black people?
We think that the bill that was recently signed into law by Governor Stitt is simply shameful. We know 100 years ago there was a conspiracy of silence. My great-grandmother never talked about it. So many other folks' mother Fletcher, they didn't want to talk about it because they told them if they did, they would be next. They would be lynched next. And it wasn't until I went off to college that I learned about it. And again, we think that is shameful.
Well, thank you so much, Tiffany Crutcher, an activist in Tulsa whose brother was killed by the police. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much, Yamiche, for having me.